Nestled in the rolling hills of western Massachusetts, the Berkshires are a patchwork of forests, farmland, and small towns where time seems to slow. Life here is simple, quiet. Generations have grown up fishing in its creeks, attending its churches, and watching the seasons change. But on one night in 1969, something disturbed that peace, something no one could explain. It began on the evening of September 1st. The air was warm with the last breath of summer. Families were driving home from Labor Day picnics. Children were counting the final hours before school resumed. And then, lights, hovering, silent. From Great Barrington to Sheffield, dozens of residents reported seeing strange, circular craft in the sky, bright, unmoving, emitting no sound, no exhaust. And in some cases, people didn't just see the lights, they lost time. The reports came in waves. A radio DJ driving home saw a blinding flash and woke up miles away. The clock in his car stopped. A woman and her children, while crossing a bridge, described being lifted in a column of light and then finding themselves back in their vehicle with hours unaccounted for. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they weren't alone in their stories. Independent witnesses, spread across multiple towns, reported nearly identical experiences. No coordination, no connection, just the same blank stares, missing time, and that humming light. It didn't take long before local law enforcement was overwhelmed. Dispatch logs show an unusual spike in 911 calls that night, all reporting lights in the sky. Missing persons later found dazed, and in one case, a school bus left idling on the roadside, its driver nowhere to be found. The incident would eventually be chronicled by national outlets and UFO investigators, but for decades, many locals refused to speak of it. Why? Because even stranger than the sightings themselves was how quickly the story seemed to disappear. What made the Berkshires incident different from so many other sightings was not just the number of witnesses, it was the silence that followed. The townspeople of Sheffield, Stockbridge, and Great Barrington awoke the morning after with a collective unease. Many recalled vivid dreams, of lights, of floating, of voices that spoke without sound. But more than that, there was confusion. Entire families had gone to bed with fragmented memories. Children told their parents about the floating room or the blinking stars that talked. Parents tried to dismiss it, until they heard the same thing from their neighbors. One mother, Nancy Reed, recounted her 6-year-old son waking up screaming, claiming he had been touched by the glowing people. She chalked it up to a nightmare, until she noticed 2 small round marks on his neck. Doctors later called it an allergic reaction, but Nancy never believed that. That same morning, the local elementary school reported a dozen students absent without explanation. When calls were placed to their homes, some parents claimed their children had been too scared to leave the house. Others didn't remember receiving the call at all. More unsettling was the radio silence. Literally. The night of the incident, a local ham radio operator named Ernest Whitmore was transmitting out of his basement in Egremont. He kept a log of every session. Frequencies, call signs, signal strength. At 9:12 p.m., he noted wideband interference, likely atmospheric. Then, nothing. His equipment went dead. No static, no signal, just a blank band. It stayed that way for nearly 3 hours. The following day, Ernest found his equipment still offline, fried. Nearby power lines were undamaged. Weather reports were clear. What could have caused a blackout of only his gear? Or more importantly, who could have wanted to block just one voice in the dark? Dozens of residents also reported their clocks and watches had stopped between 8:45 p.m. and 9:15 p.m., only to resume ticking later, minutes, or even hours off schedule. That window of time now dubbed the Lost Hour by local investigators, has become the focal point of the incident timeline. But not everyone was content to write it off as electrical issues or sleepy memories. A handful of brave locals began to dig deeper, to connect the dots, to compare notes, and what they found led to even stranger truths. After the initial fear faded, a small group of residents began to piece together what they'd seen, or rather, what they'd all felt. In a farmhouse just outside of Great Barrington, a retired schoolteacher named Lydia Moreau started mapping the incident based on what she called frequency moments. She had recorded radio interference, unexplained static bursts, and fluctuations in her home's electric meter on the night of September 1st. She cross-referenced these times with news clippings and first-hand accounts. The result was a strange diagram, not a map of space, but of time. Each major report of missing time, strange lights, or interference occurred at roughly 9-minute intervals, 9 minutes apart. In some cases, the lights appeared to follow a curved path, looping from town to town, almost like a slow-moving spiral across the region. Lydia called it the circuit, and she wasn't alone in noticing the pattern. An amateur astronomer named Todd Graham had been stargazing that same night with his son. He had captured photos of the moon using a long exposure lens, photos that, when developed, showed something odd, streaks of light that cut across the frame in a circular arc, as if orbiting just below the cloud layer. They weren't meteors. The shape was too controlled, too symmetrical. He sent the negatives to a lab. They disappeared in transit. But the spiral pattern was more than just a coincidence. Overlaid on a topographic map, it revealed something unnerving. Each pulse point, as Lydia called them, lined up with one of the area's covered bridges, radio towers, and power substations. Could the lights have been targeting something? Were they drawn to infrastructure, or were they using it? The idea of a structured visitation, one based on timing, repetition, and proximity, gave new credibility to what had once been written off as local hysteria. One investigator noted the similarity to radar sweeps, each pass illuminating more of the grid. If that's true, then the events of that night may not have been random at all, but deliberate. And if someone or something was surveying the Berkshires, then we must ask, what were they looking for, and did they find it? While adults were left puzzled or shaken by the incident, it was the children who provided the most haunting and consistent details. In the weeks following September 1st, several students at local schools began sharing their stories, first with classmates, then with counselors, and eventually investigators. One boy, 11 years old, drew a picture of what he called the tall silver men. His drawing showed elongated figures with oversized heads, almond-shaped eyes, and 3 long fingers on each hand. He claimed he saw them in the White Room, a place filled with light where he couldn't move or speak, but could hear them talking inside his head. A young girl named Tara said she had been floated out of her bed, through the wall of her house, into what she described as a round room that hummed. She remembered being surrounded by a soft blue light and hearing the phrase, "We mean no harm," repeatedly in her thoughts. These children had never met. They lived in different towns. Yet their descriptions matched nearly perfectly. As more testimonies emerged, psychologists were called in to evaluate the children. Many expected signs of mass hysteria or suggestion, but what they found instead were signs of trauma, consistent with post-event stress, nightmares, sleepwalking, aversion to light, even temporary mutism in some. Then there was Tommy Andrews. Tommy was 8 at the time of the incident. His parents described him as talkative, imaginative, always asking questions. But after that night, Tommy didn't speak for nearly a month. When he finally did, He told his parents simply, "They told me to forget." He later described in detail a bright chamber with no doors, where he was shown a model of Earth surrounded by lights moving in circles. He said the beings had eyes that didn't blink. Tommy's story, along with others, was submitted to a retired military intelligence analyst named Harold Connors, who had become fascinated with high-consistency UFO cases. Connors noted that the children's recollections shared structural similarities with known abduction reports, despite none of them having prior exposure to such cases. More than anything, he was disturbed by one specific detail. Every child who spoke of the beings referred to them in plural, always they, never it. As if the visitors that night weren't a singular entity, but a coordinated presence. If there was one thing the Berkshires residents wanted more than answers, it was acknowledgement. For years after the 1969 incident, families filed reports, contacted officials, and wrote letters to local government offices. But the responses were all the same: polite dismissal. Records from town meetings held later that fall show that dozens of residents brought up the strange events. But the transcripts are oddly vague. Mentions of unusual weather, confused citizens, and power fluctuations. No specific mention of lights, missing time, or unidentified aerial phenomena. In 1972, a Freedom of Information Act request was filed by a regional UFO researcher named Diane Blackstone. Her request sought federal logs or air traffic anomalies for the week of the event. The reply came 6 months later. We were unable to locate any responsive documents. But in 1994, while cleaning out the basement of her late uncle's farmhouse, Diane found a dusty cardboard box containing carbon copies of state-level incident reports. One form, dated September 3, 1969, listed several of the children by name. It was marked Field Investigation Incomplete and signed off by someone at the Massachusetts State Police, a name that didn't match any known employee. There was also a faded photograph, a nighttime shot of Route 7. In the sky, 3 dots, equidistant, triangular formation. The date stamp, September 1st, 69. The back of the photo had one phrase, scrawled in red pencil: "Not stars." Diane attempted to publish her findings. Several local papers declined. One editor told her bluntly, "We've been advised to leave that night alone." Then there was the matter of the missing bus driver. Local archives still list one unsolved disappearance from that night: Carl Winthrop, age 42. He had been driving home after his evening route when his vehicle was found idling near a field in Stockbridge. The bus was empty. His personal effects were still on the dashboard. Carl was never seen again. His case remains open. Over time, people stopped asking questions. Some out of fear, others because the silence became normal, but those who remember still remember everything. And buried in filing cabinets, basements, and boxes scattered across the county, there are fragments of a truth that someone clearly wanted forgotten. 50 years after the strange night in the Berkshires, the story was nearly lost to time. That is, until something happened in the fall of 2019. In the town of Lee, Massachusetts, a group of amateur radio enthusiasts set up for their annual meteor scatter experiment, broadcasting signals off the ionized trails left by meteors to bounce transmissions beyond the horizon. That evening, one of their rigs picked up an anomalous return ping. The signal was faint, repeating at irregular intervals. But its cadence was familiar. One of the operators, a retired Air Force communications officer, noticed the pattern mirrored a narrowband sequence used by military radar in the 1960s. It pulsed in threes: 3 long, 3 short, 3 long. Not quite Morse code, not quite noise. They triangulated the origin, somewhere in the wooded hills east of Sheffield. The area was undeveloped, save for an old radio tower decommissioned in the 1980s. A team returned the following day. They found nothing unusual, just remnants of weather-worn equipment and a rusted transformer box. But when one of them turned on a handheld receiver, the signal was still there. Faint, persistent. As quickly as it appeared, it vanished. Gone by the end of the week. What was it? A residual echo? A reactivation of long-dormant tech? Or something else entirely? The return signal sparked renewed interest in the original 1969 case. Former witnesses began to speak again. Podcasts, investigators, and documentary crews descended upon the Berkshires. And once more, strange stories began to surface. One woman claimed she found a child's shoe buried under her porch, identical to the kind worn in the 60s, oddly preserved. Another man, hiking through October Mountain State Forest, found symmetrical scorch marks in a clearing where no fire had ever been recorded. Whatever happened that night in 1969 may not be over. Some believe it was a one-time event, a mistake, a brief collision between dimensions or timelines. But others, especially those still living in the Berkshires, believe it was a test, and tests have follow-ups. Thank you for joining us for the Berkshires UFO Incident, a town frozen in time. If you found this story intriguing, chilling, or thought-provoking, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Your support helps us keep these forgotten stories alive. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only recorded.